there is a selection process and we do have to leave out certain stories. We sort of create a basket of stories. So first, a few rules that we follow. We don't go too long into the past. The general rule that we follow is it needs to be something post-Kargil war. So something in the last 20 years, and that's the upper limit. We prefer something in the last, 5, 6, 7, 8 years is the general period that we cover, because we believe that the stories that we want to tell, should be sort of appealing to the current generation in terms of the circumstances, the technology used, the communication strategies, etc.
Hello and welcome to the Filter Koffee Podcast. My guest today, Shiv Aroor, is among India's most respected journalists as an editor and anchor for India Today. While we've all seen him as a primetime news journalist, Shiv has also become the most authoritative voice when it comes to defense in the last decade or so. It's common knowledge that tracking defense as a journalistic beat is one of the most challenging. But Shiv's approach to this seems not just a journalistic pursuit, but one of deep passion. He is what I would call as a defense nerd. In fact, his blog, Live Fist, is highly awarded and one of the best sources of information and opinion on the topic. Shiv, along with Rahul Singh, co-wrote India's Most Fearless, a collection of true stories on modern military heroes in 2017. It is a book that recently also became a very famous web series called Avrodh, The Siege Within, which you can catch on Sony Live. The third edition of the series was released just a few weeks back. The book is a very unique rendition of stories of valor, not just from the field of battle, but also from various other places where the Army, Navy, and the Air Force have been deployed in the country. Part 3 includes a range of stories, from that of an army medic who went way beyond his call of duty during the Galwan Valley clash with China, to those who put their lives at stake to rescue hundreds from Cyclone Tauktae in the Arabian Sea, and many more. I spoke to Shiv about the books, his passion for defense, why he feels the need to tell these stories at a very personal level, and the process of researching for each of them. Stay with us. We'll be right back on the Filter Koffee Podcast. Welcome to the Filter Koffee Podcast. Shiv, how are you doing and where are you talking to us from?
Good to see you, Karthik. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm here from Delhi.
Excellent. You were in a bit of a hurry and you said a lot of things going on in the office. I hope it's a slow news day, or is it not?
It's never a slow news day, unfortunately. And I've just gotten out of my daily 5 p.m. show. It's an hour-long show, so I'm just running up the stairs. So that's why I'm a little out of breath, but I had to keep time. So sorry I'm late, but yeah, there's no slow news day. In this part of the world, at least.
Not at all. Like we were talking, before the recording, I'm a huge fan of the series. Yes, Most Fearless. There's a lot of questions I've been meaning to ask you about it. Some about the book and mostly about, your motivation to write this. But I thought I should start probably much earlier in your career, in your journey, and ask you what sort of drew towards it. So, you are the great grandson of a very popular Kannada poet and scholar, Sri Panje Mangesh. So your success as an author and storyteller is quite explainable. But tell us about your fascination for all things defense and how the journey began for you. That's a story we don't know.
Yeah. Well, Karthik, actually, my journey with defense started quite inadvertently, actually. It wasn't something that I was aiming at. Growing up, I didn't have much exposure to the military because, I grew up in Chennai. That's where I was born and brought up. And, as most people know, there's not much exposure to the military in that part of the world, because there are less cantonments, less, units around those areas and stuff. So there's not much of a, sort of military surrounding as such, even though, of course, Chennai does have a cantonment, etc. But not much of a exposure in that sense to defense. So my plunge into defense happened entirely by chance and not at all of my choosing. Looking back on it, it was a stroke of luck, actually, because it was in 2004 when I'd started off my career a few years before that as a financial business journalist. Very difficult to believe looking back now that I started off covering the corporate sector and stock markets and things like that. And I knew pretty soon that this is not at all what I want to do. And so I basically applied for a job at the Indian Express as a political reporter because, like any journalist, sort of entering the profession with stars in your eyes and, that whole, I want to change things, etc. The first sort of thing you want to do is politics. Politics is the lifeblood of the country and things like that. So as it turned out, Karthik, the Indian Express didn't have a vacancy for a political reporter, but for some reason they wanted to hire me anyway. So the editor at that time, who continues to be one of my earliest mentors, is Shekhar Gupta, was the editor at that time, and he said, "Look, we don't have a political reporter vacancy, but we recently, our defense correspondent recently left us, so that post is free if you want it." And I thought he was joking. I said, "Are you serious? I'm like 22 years old. Are you sure you want to put me into something like defense, which is like a complicated, nuanced sort of beat, which requires years of experience and, seriousness to get into? Are you sure you want to risk putting someone like me into it?" And he said, "Well, normally I wouldn't, but I do want a fresh set of eyes and I'm willing to do something like this." So I was literally thrown into the deep end. Karthik.
Wow.
I didn't ask to cover defense. I wanted to actually just, be a political reporter. But 2004, it all began, and there's been no looking back, because defense, as most people, who are either involved in defense or cover defense will tell you, it's like a black hole in a good way. It just completely devours you. It takes over your life because it's a subject with such huge demands on your time and brain power and investment in your emotions, etc., that you find yourself sort of transformed completely. You're always thinking about defense. You're thinking about the people in defense. You're thinking about how you're going to get that next big story, because it's notoriously difficult to get stories in defense, especially at that time. And this was an era in the early days of the internet, Karthik. No smartphones. Keeping in touch with people was an absolute nightmare. Email was like the sort of thing to use at that time. It was difficult, but yeah, that was the starting point as far as defense was concerned.
Amazing. Sorry, I have to ask because I didn't take you for a Chennai boy. I am one. Which part of town did you grow up in?
When I was born, my parents lived in Egmore, in a place called Victoria Crescent, right behind Etiraj College, which is a landmark. Then we moved
for multiple reasons.
Moved just a few kilometers away up on same Etiraj Saleh, which at that time used to be called Commander-in-Chief Road, which is strange because Commander-in-Chief is like a defense term. Right? So that would be my closest. I looking back on it, I kept thinking, which Commander-in-Chief was this? There was no Commander-in-Chief in Chennai, so I never quite knew which Commander-in-Chief they were talking about. Probably some British Raj thing. So anyway, grew up there, and when I finally left Chennai, when I was after finishing school and everything, we lived in Kilpok, in Punamali High Road.
Oh, wonderful. Not very far, but yeah, of course, clearly early signs were there. Yeah.
Karthik, even though I've spent many more years in Delhi than I have in Chennai, Chennai is still home for me. I still consider it my city. I was there just a few weeks ago to give a lecture at Madras Christian College, and that's still my place. That's my city.
Wonderful. Beautiful. Next time you're there, we need to catch up in person.
Yeah.
You're also, besides just, and I'll talk to you about defense as a beat just shortly. There's also this extraordinary blog/website that you've been curating now, more than a decade now?
Yeah, since 2007, actually.
Wow.
Yeah. You're talking about Live Fist, right?
Live Fist, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, you can finish your question, then I'll answer you.
No, I was going to ask you, it's just, sometime back I was searching for something else and then I landed on it. I did not know that that's something that curating. And I want to talk to you about that journey and then also that name, that URL. What does it stand for?
Okay. Yeah. The best part about that name is I keep getting messages from people on the social media handles saying, why did you choose this name? This sounds like a porn site. And the name Live Fist keeps getting bounced by university servers and safety protocols and stuff. Something that sounds like Live Fist tends to get banned and stuff. And this has actually happened. I've had people send me those error messages and saying this site looks suspicious because of the name, so we won't allow you to view it, etc.
Right.
But I kind of stuck to it because I wish there was a more interesting story about the name, but there actually isn't. When I was in university in the UK, at that time when you're very politically charged up and you've got, communist views and, all of us go through that. And at that time, I was very taken with the symbol of the fist, which is a very visible symbol of communism and resistance and things like that.
Yeah.
And I come up with a political cartoon series. I used to be a political cartoonist very briefly, totally amateur, not professional at all, just for myself and my friends. And I had a little website and I called it Live Fist. Even though it had nothing to do with communism, it was basically stuff about 9/11 and terrorism and things like that and democracy and things like that. Well, obviously the political cartoon career never really took off. But as my journalism career moved forward, that name kind of stuck with me. I really loved the name Live Fist. It really resonated with me. And when I started this website, this blog at that time, when I was looking for a name, and I just thought, why don't I just use that same name? I mean, it's defense. It's about war. It's about all these terrible things. And, just the word life is kind of sort of resonates with that kind of domain as well. So I just went with it. And I like the idea that it's a name that's kind of, people tend to ask why that name. I just like the fact that it's not an obvious name to have. So that kind of appealed to me as well. So that's how it started.
Yeah, but if it helps, when I was thinking why this name, the symbol did come to my mind first.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it does. It
In
does.
fact, one of the first banner logos we had was like a fist. It wasn't the red fist, but we painted it yellow. But yeah, lots of our viewers said, "Listen, that's like a communist symbol. Why are you using a communist symbol for a website about weapons and defense and stuff?" So I said, "Yeah, I'm keeping the name. I'm not going to change the name, but yeah, I think we'll drop that logo." So, yeah,
Yeah, I'm glad you stuck to it. It has a very, very unique story to it. Coming to the book, Shiv, I want to say not accidentally, I wasn't looking for that particular book and I picked it up, the first one, I think in an airport, if I'm not wrong, many years back. And I instantly, fell in love with the way, you had narrated it. And I think it has only gotten better in edition 3. Without going too much into the stories that the book holds, which is for people to read and then experience in that way. What was your motivation? Now you're probably a full-fledged defense reporter. Why the book and why this journey?
Well, so you're right, Karthik, when you say that I've been in this whole defense space it started in 2004, so 18 years. I've been doing it for a really, really long time, and pretty much most of my career, because my career had just begun 2 years before that. So a 20-year career, 18 years has been steeped in defense, and one of the privileges of defense has been being exposed firsthand to the actual men and women who are in operations, who are in counter-terror operations, humanitarian operations, UN peacekeeping operations, actual fights, conflict, war, the LOC, the LC, Ladakh, things like that. And it had always kind of occurred to me that every single year on Independence Day, Republic Day, there are these gallantry medals that are given out. And there are these very short, sort of terse press releases that come out in a pretty vanilla way, sort of describing why those people have been given those awards. And those get published in various small snippets and articles. Maybe they have small appearances on TV. And so it always occurred to me that, these must be fabulous stories if someone went into a little bit more detail. I mean, if this person has, been worthy of a medal, it must be a story worth hearing, in a big way. So on one particular occasion in 2017, Republic Day, I just happened to see this one snippet. I mean, and you can imagine, Karthik, these stories are coming twice a year in large numbers. So there are lots of these stories of bravery and, gallantry and daring and things like that. There was this one story of this young pilot, Indian Air Force pilot, guy in his 20s, whose MiG-29, the canopy blew off mid-flight. This is from the first book. And he was going supersonic, very, very scary. He was injured because of the shattering glass and stuff. And instead of ejecting, he sort of just kept his wits together, used all his, training and strength and courage, and he managed to actually land that plane. And there was something about that story that really sort of reached out to me. I was like, wow, what was I doing in my 20s? Just like messing around. And here's this guy landing a plane. He could have easily ejected. Nobody would have blamed him for it. And he managed to land this plane. What an amazing story. So I called up the Air Force and said, look, I don't want your press release. I want to talk to this guy. I want to do a deeper story. And thankfully, the Air Force was, yeah, sure. It was weird that nobody had reached out to the Air Force and said, I want to tell this story in greater detail. So they were like, sure, absolutely. Here's his number. I will have a word with him. Please call him whenever you want and go for it. So I called him. He was in Jodhpur at that time, and I got the whole story. And I did a story on Life Fist. In fact, I did a blog post, a long, I think a 4,000-word blog post on it. And that kind of exploded. It went, viral has many definitions, but that story did really, really well. It was shared and it was followed up and it was all over the place. It was the talk of the town. It was trending on Twitter, that kind of thing. And when that happened, so a very close friend of mine in the Hindustan Times, Rahul Singh, he called me to sort of say, great work and this, that, and the other. So I said, yeah, I've decided I'm going to do these stories like regularly now on Life Fist. And he said, instead of doing them on Life Fist, why don't we do them as a book? I'll help you. I'll come in with you. We'll decide the stories because it's too much work for one person. Let's go for it. If the Air Force, and clearly your post has demonstrated that these stories can be hugely popular. They'll have a wide readership, and people are interested in these stories. This has been the proof of concept, as it were. So we were very excited. And Karthik, just like I think 3 months later or 2 months later, we had a book deal with Penguin. It moved really, really fast. And Penguin had obviously already seen that story going viral online and stuff. So they were like, yeah, absolutely, let's do this. So they signed us up, and I think just a few short months later, we had the book was out, and things kind of snowballed really, really fast, Karthik, after that, because we went back to the military after that and said, this story's done really well. Now we're doing a book. Let's make this really big. And this is just, remember, this is just a few months after the Uri surgical strikes. So when we went, with a very small voice, we thought, do you think we can also do a chapter about the surgical strike? We were certain, we were like 100% sure that the army is going to say, are you crazy? No way, man. That is secret stuff. That's never going to happen. But to their credit, and General Bipin Rawat was in office at that time. And he said when we asked him this, can we do the surgical strikes chapter? Exact words were, why not? He just said, why not? You put in a request. Let's see. Let's put it through the process. Let it go through all the layers of checks and all that. Why not? We should tell the story. So cut forward a few months, and the book was out with an incredible first-hand chapter with the major who led the transporter strikes. So it was crazy. That's really how it began.
Yeah, Major Rawat is interesting, right? I think your third. This is the third edition of this series, and I think if I'm not wrong, you start with an acknowledgement to him, saying that he was very keen for the book to come out. You keep saying that he was constantly following up with you, saying, when is it coming out? And of course, he wouldn't be there to...
We actually, met him. We met him about 4 days before before the helicopter crash in which he passed away. 4 days before that, where he said, guys, where's the book? Where's the third book? You're supposed to be bothering me about it. It's already December 4th. We met him. December 8th, he was gone, and there's still a sense of disbelief. And he was really in many ways, the kind of engine behind this whole thing, because he's the guy who said, why are you guys being so timid and shy about this? Let's do it. It's a big way. I'll get you all your permissions that you want. These are stories that must be told. The army doesn't own these stories. The country should hear about these stories. So he was very, very eager and very encouraging about it. He was the engine behind it, most certainly.
And my apologies for the slip. I meant General Rawat, I think.
I understood that. What you're saying.
This is almost like putting an editorial view over these stories, right? I was very interested in understanding from you, how do you select the stories that you finally want in one of these books, right? I'm assuming you probably do a lot of research, probably consider more number of stories than you actually write about, and then say, okay, these are the 4 or 5 that I want to write about. Talk to us a little bit about that process.
Yeah, so you're right. There is a selection process, and we do have to leave out certain stories. We sort of create a basket of stories. So first, a few rules that we follow. We don't go too long into the past. The general rule that we follow is it needs to be something post-Kargil war. So something in the last 20 years, and that's the upper limit. We prefer something in the last, 5, 6, 7, 8 years is the general period that we cover, because we believe that the stories that we want to tell, should be sort of appealing to the current generation in terms of the circumstances, the technology used, the communication strategies, etc.
Also, the political landscape will be more relatable. Right?
It's more relatable, most certainly. And also, the other reason, Karthik, was because we believe that, India's previous conflicts, like 71 war, 65 war, 62 war, the Kargil war itself, the 47 operation, they've been covered in great detail. People have written many, many books about those. It's the individual, non-war operations that have been missed out. And that's where India's Most Fearless comes in. Because what we're covering is not a war. A war has, India's wars have gotten a great deal of attention. Fabulous books have been written, about our wars. There are official histories about all these wars. Really terrific accounts of all these things, have been written. So the void that we sought to fill with India's Most Fearless is individual heroism and individual acts of valor and courage, that tend to sort of fall through the cracks because they aren't part of this umbrella of a war or a conflict or an operation. And that's why we did that. So we choose operations that are recent. We give it a kind of, sort of a spread of stories. Like if we've got 10 or 12 stories and 6 of those will be Army, 2 Air Force, 2 Navy, as many as possible. So there's an even sort of spread between them, even though it doesn't really reflect how it works. But the Army obviously will have more operations. The Air Force sometimes will have operations that don't really involve, offensive attacks. Of course, the second book had the Balakot airstrikes, but usually they'll be, air emergencies or humanitarian relief kind of stories or, mid-air disasters, that kind of thing. And the Navy also is usually with humanitarian relief and disasters and that kind of thing. So that's how we choose our stories. In every case, Karthik, we choose more stories than we need. And then we kind of narrow it down based on how not only is there a geographic spread, so that all the stories are not based in Kashmir. We have stories of something in the Kashmir, something in the Arabian Sea, something in the Northeast, something in Ladakh, that kind of thing. So there's a geographical spread. There's a even spread between officers and enlisted men, soldiers, sailors, airmen. That there's a spread between kinds of operations, not just anti-terror, but also humanitarian operations. Daring during technical emergencies. Personal acts of human valor, saving lives, that kind of thing. So there's an even spread, not just about killing of terrorists and things like that, which tends to be what bravery in the military is associated with. But we think it's much more nuanced than that. So those are some of the sort of things we consider when we choose.
I had not thought of, as a reader, I had not realized that there was an even distribution of it like this. It just seemed very, very seamless. In fact, to your point, the current one also has a cyclone rescue aspect to this as well from the Arabian Sea. I wanted to ask, before we go into this particular book itself, what was the reaction from people in defense services to these books? Because I remember when I was in school, growing up in Chennai, there was a series called Paramvir Chakra, which I absolutely loved. Right, it was very, very well made. Those stories were, well researched, deep, and of course, if someone is winning the Paramvir Chakra, obviously the story itself is extraordinary. So it was goosebumps every time we saw it. And then after that, I felt like the narrative itself got lost a bit. Right, we didn't for a while we didn't know who our heroes were and what they did. Just went as a passing newspaper article. But now that you made this into this series that is easy for everyone to understand. The narrative is simple enough for everyone to understand. It's not jargon heavy. How do families and the defense forces, who I'm sure you meet very often, how do they react?
Overwhelmingly positively, Karthik. They've embraced it an impossibly big way because, like I said, it's most military families. I'll tell you about some of the examples of criticism also we faced because that's also important to talk about. But overwhelmingly, the reactions from military families, military personnel serving retired has been, finally someone has done this. Finally, someone has decided to tell these stories that tend to just sort of sit on the shelves and never get told in any great detail. And therefore, they're kind of lost, in the pages of history that nobody's ever written about them. And this is something I say pretty often, and it's still a problem. I'm sure you know this as well, that in this country, either with regard to the military or the writing about it, either there is this overt nationalistic, Bharat Mata ki Jai type exaltation of the military, or they're completely ignored. There's no nuanced, just basic storytelling. And in India's Most Fearless, we've sought to kind of strike a balance where I've just told them great adventure stories or action stories, because that's what they are. The emotions that they evoke are, those are inherent in the stories because that's the way the stories are. They are emotional stories. They are provocative stories. But we never intended to make them tear-jerkers or emotional. I mean, I think all of that is part of the story. But the overwhelming reaction has been finally someone telling these stories in a way that everyone can embrace them, understand them, follow them, and appreciate and admire them because they truly bring out the essence of how normal soldiers are. It's not making them into these superhumans. Right. It's relatable. They're also people like us. They've got the same shitty problems that we have. They've got the same crappy stuff that we've got to deal with, and also do these amazing, crazy things that's required of them in the line of duty. So that's the kind of reality we wanted to capture. And I think as far as feedback is concerned, we've done that pretty well. Families, have seen, we've been overwhelmed by the responses from families because they see it as a series that, is a kind of repository of, justice done to loved ones, justice done to those families and those people, rather than just a citation and a medal. But, a book has a kind of infinity about it, right? More than a press release or a TV show or a report or an article. A book is forever. Yeah. And there's something, timeless about a book. It will stay there forever, especially, and India's Most Fearless has been translated into other languages as well. That aspect of it has been welcomed with open arms. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question. But as far as...
You spoke about the critique.
There have been some who say, should we be giving out so many details? Is it right to, this is a sensitive area. Should we be, doing this kind of thing? And we've always, Karthik, we've been very humble about criticism. We believe we're open to criticism. And we've always said, look, these stories are written by us with complete faith and access provided by the military. And on our part, with our own good faith, we show all these stories to the military to vet in case there is something that we've said that, could be a problem as far as intelligence is concerned. Because let's face it, any story about the military, the quote unquote enemy is going to be reading them as well. The adversaries will be reading them. Is there anything that is mentioned in which can corroborate an old piece of intelligence that they were not sure about? Distances, locations, which unit is deployed where, was this person killed in an operation, etc., that kind of thing, minute little things that can be picked up. So we always were very clear that all of our stories have been, vetted is a bit of a strong word, because on to the credit of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, Karthik, they never changed a thing. They made suggestions to us. They said, in this, maybe don't name this place. With regard to special forces officers, don't reveal their real names because they're still out there in those places. They're wanted by these terror groups and stuff. So those little things were suggestions. They were never orders. The best part is the military never ordered us to make these changes. See, this is great, but maybe consider isko thoda badal do to theek rahega. That kind of thing. Never saying unless you change this, we will not clear it. That kind of thing. So they were amazing about it. They were very open-hearted about it, and because I think they really believed in the benefit of these stories. Because it's exposing the military to an enormous audience that has no access to this kind of thing. And here you not only get to look at valor, but you also get to soak in military life, the emotions that go with everyday military life. We've received hundreds of messages, even though it was not even our intention, that people are inspired to join the forces because of these books. These books are very far from being recruitment material. They're not. In fact, most people who read these books, I sometimes feel, may not even want to join the military, because these are dangerous situations, scary situations. Nobody wants to be in those situations, but people are like, I've read this book, I want to do this. I want to be here. I want to be in a position where I can do something like this. So those are the kinds of things, reactions that we normally get. Yeah.
I can probably say to a certain extent I can understand why, because like you rightly said, it is like an adventure, and you don't only talk about the conflict. You, like a good film, you also talk about what is the ambient situation, right? You talk about it's almost like a day in the life of these people. You get to experience this almost firsthand. Just coming to the book, this is one of the most powerful openings to a story, that I've read, especially, from a defense perspective. And if you don't mind me, I would like to just quote a small excerpt and then ask you the question. So this is quote, "Even above the loud, steady roar of the Galwan River, he heard the thundering footfalls, the sound of over 1,000 men reverberating through the darkness, amplified by the tunnel effect of a narrow valley flanked by steep rising mountains on both sides. Peering into the black void beyond Patrol Point 14, lit only a few meters forward by handheld torches, the reality of those sounds dawned on Havildar Dharamveer Kumar Singh of Indian Army's 16th Bihar Infantry Battalion. He clenched his eyes, shut to soak in every vibration. When he opened them again, he knew that the huge horde of men advancing towards his position was not marching. They weren't even jogging. They were sprinting." This is, of course, the story of young army medic Nayak Deepak Singh. But, it was such a chilling opening to the entire conflict itself. And of course, you've reported on this probably a few hundred times. But for the listeners, why is the Galwan conflict unique? What differentiates it, and why is the story that needs telling?
Karthik, the fact that it is unique is because it was an open war-like situation, a battle situation between two armies that have not fired at each other in anger for nearly half a century. These are two countries that had very robust border protocols ever since the 62 war. The last time, there was any real violence between the two sides was in the 70s. And since then, there has been no blood spilled on either side, because even though they have a disputed border, there was a very strongly followed border tranquility protocol by these two countries, because both countries had seen war. Both are giant Asian nations, nuclear armed, and countries with otherwise close relations. And therefore, having any kind of border escalation was unthinkable. And so the Galwan flare-up, the flashpoint, that the violence that took place there, was so completely removed from the reality of what the unit, the army, the command, the country expected at that point of time. There was no doubt in our minds that it had to be the story we told in our third book, because remember that it became a subject of claims, counterclaims, propaganda. How many people died? Why didn't India do this? How could China do this? Why don't we have pictures? Why don't we release pictures? There was so much anguish in Indian minds that it became obvious to our readers. And what I love about India's Most Fearless, and this is not a boast, but we have like this community of readers that we've spawned who are constantly talking to us. They're actually shaping our books before they come out. So, when the Galwan thing happened a few weeks later, floods of messages saying, I hope you're already working on this. Your third book is not out yet. Don't even think about bringing out your third book without Galwan in it. Otherwise, nobody's going to read it. And even before they said that, we were like, obviously, we have to tell this story. I mean, in the first book, we had done the Uri surgical strikes. In the second book, we had done Balakot. So we'd already set the bar really high, Karthik, in terms of telling the biggest operation that has happened in that time. And so Galwan had to be. It was unique because it was terrible loss of life. The entire story had captured the emotions of the country. You saw the coverage and stuff. There was this great nationalistic fervor against China. But none of those reasons were the reasons to write it. The reasons to write it was because it was a news story. It was a plain and simple black and white, conflict story. And we had to tell it. We didn't see it as a choice. We had to tell the story no matter what. But what struck us as something that would have been interesting, and this is something that was actually the army's idea, was why didn't you do it from the perspective of you can do it from a perspective of one of the frontline soldiers who fought. Or you can do it from the perspective of a person who was there saving lives. So this terrible contrast, right? Just blood and killing and hand-to-hand combat and skulls being smashed and things like that, and people falling into frozen rivers. And this young guy, 30-year-old Nayak Deepak Singh, saving lives, putting together broken bones and patching up people and fixing wounds and stuff of both sides, is such a ironic and painful story. And therefore, there was no doubt in our minds that this was a story that needed to be told. We didn't see it as an option at all. I'm guessing you've already read the story. So the fact is that we spoke to a number of soldiers who were part of the fighting. Nayak Deepak Singh, unfortunately, is no longer alive. He lost his life in that operation. But we were speaking to all of the soldiers who were part of that operation. And even as far as the chapter is concerned, there were so many aspects of it that we couldn't put in it because, there are sensitivities as far as distances and this, that, and the other are concerned, Karthik. So what we finally put in was intended to answer many of the unanswered questions that people had in their minds. We're not supposed to be propaganda busters. Our job is journalists and writers. We chronicle what happened. We're not sitting here in order to, fact check China or something like that. But many people said, your story, since it's an authentic account from soldiers, attributed to soldiers who were there in that unit on the ground at that point of time. It's incredible. And India is a democratic nation. China is a country that has never put out information about its operations.
Yeah.
Who should the world believe as far as this is concerned? And, that's an easy answer. That's not a tough one to answer. So I think that's why Galwan was so important to tell.
Another thing, Shiv, that I want to ask you about, people like me, who didn't know much about the strategic importance of this, who were reading newspaper reports. Another reason why, this also felt very unique was the quote unquote unconventional fighting that happened. This is not the typical, fighter jets and guns sort of a battle. And this reminded me of another interview I had done some time back. Rachna Bisht was on the show to talk about her 1971 book, which is The Charge of the Gorkhas, that particular battle where decidedly the Indian army decided to not use guns and use only their kukris. And my sense, as a layman, is that combats like these get very, very bloody, right? And very, very, very violent. So you spoke about Nayak Deepak Singh. Tell us a little bit about that aspect of this. How gruesome was this particular conflict?
It was, see, the thing is, the Galwan bloodshed happened over a period of a few hours, and there were, pockets of fighting that took place, Karthik. It wasn't just one long, extended brawl by a huge crowd of soldiers, it's tempting for people to think of it as just one crazy free-for-all by hundreds of soldiers. That wasn't what it was. It was, groups of soldiers fighting in kind of disparate places in the Galwan Valley. But it was terribly gruesome because it was hand-to-hand combat. The rule that all border protocols had been violated, but no firearms were used. So they were using batons, they were using shields, rocks were being thrown at each other. And remember, we're talking about thousands of feet in altitude. This was late in the night, so freezing conditions. You've got this gushing river, icy cold. So it was already a very kind of hostile, forbidding terrain that they were fighting in. The Chinese had come with these riot guard shields and these batons, clubs basically, which had these blinding flashing lights these strobe effect lights, which are designed, Karthik, for riot use. They've been used in Hong Kong and other places as well during protests and things like that. They're designed to send out these flashes that temporarily stun people in the dark. And then you're debilitated for a while and then you can attack them. So that's what the Chinese had actually come with. And there's this description that we have in the book of this huge horde of people with those blinking lights coming down the mountainside towards the Indian. The Indian side was unprepared because they were following protocol. As they say, the Indian army is an army of it's a moral army. It's an army of honor. They have never broken any of these, war protocols or conflict protocols. So there was no question of it, but the Chinese did. And so that this moral, immoral aspect is very important to tell viewers, readers around the world that...
Sorry to interrupt your flow, but just on this moral aspect, if I'm not wrong, the opening story of this medic is where he's actually treating not Indian soldier, but the Chinese soldier.
Oh, yeah. The blacks, whites and grays of this story are overwhelming, Karthik. I mean, you know it. And, those who I hope will listen to this podcast and then read the book will know it as well, that the terrifyingly painful nuance of a combat medic, this young man from the Indian soldiers' side, treating wounded persons, disregarding which side they're on, whether they're a Chinese officer or an Indian soldier. He's treating them because he's just seeing them as human, wounded, injured persons and that he needs to save their lives. And there's this awfully human aspect to it also because, and this is something that we brought out for the first time in the story, Karthik, is that many of the soldiers who were fighting each other that night actually knew each other. The main unit on the Chinese side and the main unit on the Indian side, they had an established communication protocol. They used to talk to each other. They used to walk up to each other, chat with each other. Some of the people who died, one of them was an interpreter who was a good friend of the Indian side because they knew him very well. He was the only one who spoke English. He was the guy who the Indian side, knew the most because he was the guy doing all the translations for the commanding officer. And Nayak Deepak Singh tried to save him, saying that he's the only guy who knows English. If this guy dies, we're fighting, we're killing each other, but there will be no possibility of even communicating after that in that darkness. So that was one of the also a horribly sad aspect of this whole thing, that I'm not going to go ahead and say that they were friends and there was this dosti or anything like that. But think of it as, we always, people will tend to think of, oh, they're the Chinese, they're monsters, they're, all monsters. At the end of the day, their soldiers are also deployed in a hostile area, border area, far from their homes. They've got the same shitty problems that our people have. They're also missing home. They're also homesick. They're not some robots. They're also human soldiers. They also, fighting somebody's, ill-conceived madman's war. They've also got their issues. Of course, they were following orders. They were very professional. They came in a huge way. All that we can say. But at the end of the day, armies are about generals. They're not about soldiers. It's the soldiers who die fighting. It's the armies the generals who make all the, the stupid decisions. So the fact that there was this personal connect between some of them is a very sad. I find it very sorrowful. When I think of it, I feel really, really sad. That, Haldar Dharmveer Singh, one of the soldiers said, "Hum unko jante the. हम उनको जानते थे, हम बात करते थे रोज." So there was a sense of disbelief. How could these guys, along with this larger outsider force of Chinese military, how could these guys do it? We used to talk to them on a daily basis. Where did things break down? Obviously, these were orders that came from somewhere else.
Right.
Screw your friendship. You're not there to make friends with the other side. We're here to meet our military objectives. But that's a different story. I think that just made it a very ironic, sad kind of element to the whole thing. Right. And it applies not just to Galwan, Karthik. It applies everywhere. Everywhere where you've got eyeball-to-eyeball situations. Yeah. Soldiers, they're not sitting there and sort of, looking aggressively at each other as you're tempted to think in an eyeball-to-eyeball situation. At the end of the day, they're going to have a drink with each other maybe, and wish that they didn't have to sit there and, want to kill each other.
I mean, the way it comes across to me after reading some of these stories of yours is that this is workplace, right? Just like we get up and speak to someone at a workplace.
Right.
Whether it is our organization or somebody else, they have conversations and you develop these relationships. These are workplace relationships and then they can be fairly strong, especially when there is no other civilization for hundreds of kilometers.
For example, I mean, sorry to interrupt, but in Nathula, for instance, in Sikkim, when that border opened up for trade, this was in 2006, I'd been sent there by the Indian Express at that time to cover the opening up of the Nathula Pass in Sikkim. And I remember the relationship between the Indian soldiers and the Chinese soldiers. And there they were like meters from each other, just a few meters away. There was like a border hut. And they used to meet each other every day to exchange food, And I remember the Chinese soldiers were like obsessed with Indian currency. They loved Indian currency. So they'd exchange, give notes, take notes. And I remember them badgering me, do you have 10 rupees, 5 rupees, whatever it is. And they were friends over there.
Right.
And,
Right.
in part of this 2020 conflict between India and China, there's been violence in Sikkim as well. So it's all gone to hell now.
Anyway, so one of the things I couldn't help, going to in my mind as I was reading the book is also that this would make for an extraordinary series, right? And you could already see it playing out in your mind as you're reading the book. I'm sure you get asked this question probably 100 times in a day. But is that something that's in the works?
Very much, very much. I'm not allowed to speak about it just yet, but it's in the works. There's going to be an announcement quite soon. I'm going to let that be a little bit of a surprise about who and what form, etc. But yeah, it's going to be on a screen of some kind very soon. It's going to be made, and it's happening. Two previous stories have already been made into web series. Karthik, as you might know, the Uri chapter was made into Avrod season 1. Then there was a chapter from the second book on Captain Pradeep Arya, who was a revenue services officer, taxman turned special forces commando. That became season 2 of Avrod. There's also a Tamil movie on one of the chapters that's coming out, going to be announced very soon. There is a Hindi movie being made by Manish Mundra on Major Mohit Sharma, Ashok Chakra, from the second book.
Right.
That's going to be out. It's being made as we speak. It's going to be out sometime next year. And the Galvan story, like I said, there's going to be an announcement very soon. So yes, absolutely. There's a huge amount of interest from many, many quarters, production houses, filmmakers to convert these into films and series. So across the board, there will be many more announcements this year.
Yeah, no, not surprised at all, after the success of our growth. Really looking forward to that. So we usually end the episode by asking our guest what he or she is watching, reading, or listening to at this point. But I would love to hear, how you take a break from clearly a very intense work day for you. Also, would love to hear from you. What are some of the stories of battle and war and defense that you enjoyed, either on a book or as a movie or as a series?
Okay, starting with the books I'm reading right now, I can't remember the last time I read any fiction, Karthik. I literally can't remember the last time I read a work of fiction. I have, call it the nature of my work, call it just not wanting to read fiction anymore or not having the luxury of it anymore, because I'm devouring books on history, on politics, and things like that is what I'm doing right now. I'm reading 2 books right now. One is on Uttar Pradesh politics, and the other is on Amit Shah. It's a biography of Amit Shah. I'm just consuming these books. I'm not going into how good those books are, but I'm trying to get as much information as I can. And with all these elections coming up, I'm also doing it as a kind of work thing. Just gain as much info data as possible, because it helps in that process. In terms of the shows that I'm watching, I'm a pretty scattered kind of watcher of shows, but I gravitate towards horror. Horror is my favorite genre, so I tend to watch as many horror films as I possibly can. So good, bad, horrible, crappy, I generally tend to watch them all. I'm looking forward to The Crown right now in a very big way, because that's one of my favorite shows. I love that show. So I'm looking forward greatly to The Crown at this point of time. In terms of military stuff, I can tell you that the World War series on Netflix, the World War in Color and the Road to Victory series, which are these little documentary snippets about World War II, absolutely, absolutely fabulous. In my view, if India could do something like that, have these short 1 hour chapter-wise episodes of different wars. I'd love to see something like that made in the 1971 war, for instance. The 1971 or the 65 war had these amazing different battles. The battle of Basantar, or the battle of Longewala, and all these different battles sort of televised in a way that is really, really evocative and real, without all the embellishments that we tend to put into war dramas. Would be so nice to see. And I tend to watch most war movies that are there online as well.
I know we don't have a great lineup of war films the way Hollywood does. But anything you loved on war movies we've attempted in India?
In India,
or come close to loving?
Vijayta, in my view, is one of the greatest war films we've made. I loved Vijayta. I think Hakikat on the 1962 war was a a very evocative film. Not perfect. I mean, none of these films are perfect, but of course, they've got to go with the times. There were many pulls
Yeah.
and pressures as far
Yeah.
as Bollywood was concerned. I think they were really good. The movie Lakshya, which was made quite a few years ago, the Hrithik Roshan one, it's a masala film, sure, but I don't know. That maybe I was young at that point of time, but that movie really spoke to me. The emotions in that film really spoke to me, and it still does. Actually, I watched it recently once again. And Karthik, I think Lakshya was a bit of an underrated film. It was famous for all the different reasons. It was a good story, etc., and Hrithik and all that, and great music. But the sort of theme of a person being transformed, by their time in the military is something that I see every day in the writing of my India's Most Fearless stories. Normal people, discovering completely different versions of themselves after coming into the military, and then transforming once again after being thrust into these, do or die, live or die situations, save yourself or save someone else situations. So that's not a film that I don't know. You can call it a guilty pleasure or whatever, but it's a lovely little film that actually tells people more about the little nuances of the military that sort of all-out war films don't tend to do. So yeah, I think over the top of my head, I would name those three.
Yeah, no, I'm not surprised. In fact, I spoke to someone from the army many years back, and I asked him the same question, and he said that Lakshya is also his favorite because he felt that the war scenes are closest to reality in that film, which I thought it didn't register with me when I was watching it. Then I watched it again. So yeah, love that. Yeah, Shiv, thank you so much to take time in between your very busy schedule, and good luck to the series. We really look forward to that, and good luck with everything you're pursuing right now.
Karthik, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your interest. Thank you so much.
Yes, we're done. Thanks, Shiv. That was great.
Thanks, Karthik. Great meeting you.
Same here. Speak to you soon.
Speak to you soon. Bye. Thanks.
I totally, sorry, I have to tell you, I completely forgot to ask you your interest in the wild. But that's probably good because we'll do another episode sometime soon, hopefully.
Oh, sure. Anytime. Done. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Yes, bye. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcasts.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to me, I am _Karthik. That's Karthik with an H on Twitter. And Filter_Koffee, that's coffee with a K, on Instagram.